There is a quiet pattern that emerges when you observe modern professionals closely, especially those who appear capable, educated, and positioned for upward mobility, yet remain subtly restrained in how far they actually go. And that pattern is not a lack of intelligence, nor opportunity, nor even discipline, but something far less visible and far more psychologically complex: an aversion to responsibility that disguises itself as rational decision-making. In professional environments, this rarely looks like avoidance in an obvious sense. Instead, it appears as cautious career moves, preference for stability, hesitation toward ownership, and a consistent inclination to stay within defined roles rather than expand beyond them. And while these choices often appear logical on the surface, underneath them sits a deeper psychological tension between the desire for success and the weight of what success actually demands. Because success, in its real form, is not merely financial gain or status elevation. It is the gradual accumulation of responsibility over outcomes, decisions, risks, and consequences that cannot be outsourced or diluted. And this is where the internal conflict begins to surface, because most individuals are conditioned to pursue the rewards associated with success while unconsciously resisting the responsibility structure that sustains it. If you examine the professional mindset shaped by middle-class upbringing, particularly in structured environments like corporate, consulting, or healthcare systems, you begin to notice that responsibility has often been framed as something to manage carefully rather than something to expand into. From early stages of career development, the emphasis is placed on performing well within a given scope, meeting expectations, and avoiding mistakes that carry visible consequences. And over time, this creates a psychological association where responsibility becomes linked not with autonomy, but with exposure. Exposure to judgment, exposure to failure, exposure to uncertainty. And so even as income grows and roles evolve, the underlying mental model remains surprisingly consistent. Success is something to be approached, but responsibility is something to be negotiated with, limited, or subtly avoided. This creates a paradox that many professionals experience but rarely articulate. They want the outcomes of higher success, greater income, influence, flexibility, but they hesitate at the exact point where these outcomes begin to require a different relationship with responsibility. Because responsibility at higher levels is not just an increase in workload, it is an increase in psychological ownership. It means being the final point of accountability when outcomes are unclear, when decisions are imperfect, and when there is no external structure to absorb the consequences. And for a mind that has been trained to operate within defined systems, this shift can feel less like progress and more like exposure to instability. You can see this tension in subtle behaviors. The professional who excels in execution, but avoids roles that require decision-making without clear guidelines. The individual who prefers optimizing within a system rather than building or redefining one. The hesitation that appears when opportunities involve ambiguity rather than structure. These are not signs of incapability. They are reflections of a deeper psychological negotiation happening beneath conscious awareness. A negotiation between the comfort of controlled responsibility and the uncertainty of expanded responsibility. And what makes this particularly complex is that this avoidance rarely feels like fear in the traditional sense. It feels like prudence. It feels like being strategic. It feels like making smart choices. The language itself becomes part of the mechanism that justifies staying within a certain boundary. Because acknowledging that responsibility itself is the source of discomfort would require confronting a more unsettling idea, that success is not being limited by external barriers, but by an internal threshold for how much responsibility one is willing to hold. This is where the conversation becomes more nuanced, because responsibility is not inherently intimidating in isolation. Most professionals handle significant responsibilities daily: deadlines, projects, teams, deliverables. But these responsibilities are often contained within a system that provides structure, validation, and importantly, a distribution of accountability. The fear begins to emerge when responsibility becomes less distributed and more concentrated, when the margin for deflection reduces, and when the outcomes begin to reflect not just effort, but judgment. In this sense, responsibility is not just a functional concept. It is deeply tied to identity. Taking on more responsibility implicitly asks a question. How much uncertainty are you willing to associate with who you are? Because higher responsibility increases the visibility of both success and failure, and not just externally, but internally. It removes the buffer between action and self-perception. And for many, this is where hesitation solidifies, not because they doubt their ability to succeed, but because they are not fully comfortable with the possibility of visible failure at a higher level of ownership. So, what appears on the surface as a gap between potential and outcome is often a reflection of something more internal and less discussed. It is the quiet resistance to stepping into roles where responsibility is not predefined, not limited, and not easily reversible. And until this relationship with responsibility is understood more clearly, success will continue to feel like something that is being approached but never fully entered. Now we will explore how responsibility, when examined more closely, is not avoided because it is difficult, but because it alters the psychological contract people have with their own lives, particularly in how control, certainty, and identity are experienced. At lower and mid-level professional stages, there is an implicit agreement between the individual and the system they operate within. You perform well, you follow defined structures, and in return, the system absorbs a portion of the uncertainty. Deadlines are set by others, goals are often pre-aligned, and even failure, when it occurs, is distributed across teams, processes, or external conditions. This arrangement creates a sense of controlled engagement where responsibility exists, but it is buffered. And over time, this buffering becomes not just a convenience, but an expectation. As careers progress, however, the nature of responsibility begins to shift in a way that is rarely articulated clearly. It becomes less about execution and more about interpretation, less about following direction and more about defining it. And most importantly, less about shared accountability and more about personal ownership of outcomes that are inherently uncertain. This is where the psychological contract starts to break down, because the individual is no longer operating within a system that guarantees structure. Instead, they are being asked to function in environments where clarity is incomplete, feedback is delayed, and consequences are more directly tied to their judgment. For many professionals, this transition is not experienced as an opportunity, but as a subtle loss of stability. The familiar markers that once guided decision-making, clear expectations, measurable benchmarks, predictable feedback loops, begin to fade. And in their place emerges a form of responsibility that requires internal calibration. This is significantly more validation. This is significant identity, not in terms of effort, but in terms of psychological processing. Because now decisions must be made without the same level of reassurance, and outcomes must be absorbed without the same level of distribution. This is where avoidance begins to take on more sophisticated forms. It is no longer about rejecting responsibility outright, but about selectively engaging with it in ways that preserve a sense of control. Professionals may gravitate toward roles that appear advanced but still operate within structured environments. They may pursue complexity in tasks but avoid ambiguity in decision-making. They may seek recognition for performance but remain cautious about positions where outcomes are less predictable. And importantly, these choices are rarely conscious. They are experienced as preferences, as alignment with personal strengths, or as strategic career positioning. What is often missed in this process is that the discomfort is not coming from the work itself, but from the shift in how responsibility redefines one's relationship with certainty. Because higher responsibility does not eliminate uncertainty, it amplifies it. It removes the protective layers that once filtered complexity and presents it more directly. And for a mind that has been conditioned to associate stability with correctness, this amplification can feel destabilizing. There is also a deeper layer to this, which relates to how responsibility intersects with self-perception. When operating within structured roles, individuals can separate their identity from outcomes to some extent. A failed project can be attributed to multiple variables. A delayed result can be contextualized within broader constraints. But as responsibility becomes more concentrated, this separation becomes less available. Outcomes begin to feel more personal, not because they objectively are, but because the individual's role in shaping them is more direct. This creates a subtle but persistent tension. On one hand, there is a desire to expand, to take on more meaningful work, to move closer to positions of influence and autonomy. On the other hand, there is an equally strong pull toward maintaining a level of psychological safety, where outcomes remain somewhat detached from identity. And this tension often resolves not through bold decisions, but through gradual compromise. Individuals move forward, but not fully. They accept more responsibility, but within limits that keep discomfort manageable. Over time, this pattern stabilizes into a kind of equilibrium, a professional life that is successful by conventional standards, yet constrained in ways that are difficult to explain. There is progress, but it feels incremental rather than expansive. There is achievement, but it lacks a certain depth of ownership. And beneath it all, there is a quiet awareness that something is being held back, not externally, but internally. Understanding this dynamic requires moving beyond the idea that people simply fear failure or risk. Those explanations are too surface level to capture what is actually happening. The deeper issue is that responsibility changes the nature of engagement with one's own life. It shifts the locus of control inward, but it also increases the psychological exposure that comes with that control. And unless this shift is consciously recognized and processed, it will continue to influence decisions in subtle, often unnoticed ways. This is why responsibility becomes a threshold rather than a ladder. It is not something people climb gradually without resistance. It is something they approach, negotiate with, and often stop just short of fully embracing. Not because they lack ambition, but because crossing that threshold requires a different relationship with uncertainty, identity, and control than most have been conditioned to maintain. Next, we begin to understand how the fear of responsibility is not rooted in the future, but in the past. Specifically in the way individuals were conditioned to interpret consequences, mistakes, and accountability long before they entered professional life. Because the modern professional mindset does not emerge in isolation, it is shaped over years of subtle reinforcement, where responsibility is often associated not with empowerment, but with pressure, evaluation, and the risk of getting something wrong in a way that carries visible consequences. And this early framing leaves a lasting psychological imprint that continues to influence behavior even in environments where the stakes are fundamentally different. For many, responsibility during formative years was tied closely to performance metrics, grades, expectations, approval from authority figures. It was rarely presented as an open space for exploration or ownership, but rather as something to be handled correctly. Mistakes were not always framed as part of a process, but as deviations that needed correction. And while this structure can create discipline and competence, it also builds an underlying association where responsibility becomes linked to the need for precision and the avoidance of error. Over time, this association becomes internalized, forming a mental model where taking on more responsibility implicitly means increasing the likelihood of visible mistakes. As individuals transition into professional environments, this model does not disappear. It evolves. The stakes become higher, the context becomes more complex, but the underlying interpretation remains similar. Responsibility still feels like something that must be managed carefully, not expanded freely. And even when external consequences are less severe than perceived, the internal response remains heightened because the psychological framework was built in a different context where evaluation was more immediate and less forgiving. This is why many professionals experience a disproportionate level of hesitation when faced with opportunities that involve undefined responsibility. It is not simply about the potential for failure, but about the anticipated experience of being responsible for that failure in a way that feels personal and exposed. And because this anticipation operates beneath conscious awareness, it often manifests as overanalysis, delay, or preference for roles where expectations are clearly defined and outcomes are more predictable. There is also a subtle influence of how success itself was framed during these earlier stages. In many cases, success was not associated with ownership, but with compliance. Doing well meant meeting expectations, following established paths, and minimizing deviation. This creates a version of success that is inherently structured and externally validated. But as professional life progresses, especially at higher levels, success begins to require a different set of behaviors. defining direction, making decisions without complete information, and accepting outcomes that cannot be fully controlled. This shift creates a misalignment between the internal model of success and the external reality of how success actually functions at advanced levels. The individual continues to operate with a framework that prioritizes correctness and predictability, while the environment increasingly rewards adaptability, judgment, and ownership. And within this gap, responsibility becomes the point of friction. Because stepping into higher responsibility requires not just new skills, but a recalibration of how one interprets action, consequence, and self-worth. What makes this particularly complex is that the discomfort does not always present itself clearly. It is often experienced as a sense of unease around certain types of decisions or opportunities, a subtle inclination to wait for more clarity, a preference for roles that offer defined expectations, a tendency to seek additional validation before acting. These behaviors are rarely recognized as avoidance because they align with what is often considered careful or thoughtful decision-making. But in reality, they can also function as mechanisms that maintain a familiar relationship with responsibility, one that feels controlled and predictable. Over time, this creates a pattern where individuals become highly effective within structured environments, but hesitate when asked to operate beyond them. They are capable, knowledgeable, and experienced, yet there is a noticeable boundary around how much ownership they are willing to take without external guidance. And this boundary is not imposed by external limitations, but by an internal framework that has not fully adapted to the demands of higher responsibility. Understanding this requires a shift in perspective. Responsibility is not inherently tied to evaluation in the same way it once was. The professional world, particularly at higher levels, operates with a different set of dynamics, where uncertainty is expected, mistakes are part of the process, and outcomes are influenced by variables that extend beyond individual control. But unless this distinction is consciously recognized, the earlier conditioning continues to shape interpretation, leading to decisions that prioritize psychological safety over expanded ownership. And so what appears as a cautious approach to career progression is often something more deeply rooted. It is a continuation of an earlier relationship with responsibility, one that has not been fully examined or redefined. Until that relationship changes, responsibility will continue to feel like something to be approached carefully, rather than embraced fully, and success will remain something that is pursued within limits that feel psychologically manageable, rather than explored at its full depth. Now the perspective shifts toward a more subtle layer of this dynamic, where responsibility is not just avoided because of external consequences or past conditioning, but because of what it demands internally. Specifically, the requirement to trust one's own judgment without continuous validation. At lower levels of responsibility, confidence is often supported by structure. There are benchmarks, feedback loops, and visible indicators that signal whether one is moving in the right direction. This creates a form of externally reinforced certainty, where decisions feel safer because they are aligned with predefined expectations. But as responsibility increases, this external reinforcement begins to fade, and in its place emerges a reliance on internal judgment that is far less stable for most individuals. This is where a deeper form of discomfort begins to surface, one that is not always recognized as such. Because trusting one's own judgment, especially in ambiguous situations, requires a level of psychological stability that is not commonly developed in structured environments. It requires the ability to make decisions without immediate confirmation, to hold uncertainty without seeking premature resolution, and to accept that clarity often emerges only after action has been taken. And for many professionals, this mode of operating feels unfamiliar, not because they lack intelligence, but because their experience has been shaped around environments where correctness could be verified before commitment. As a result, responsibility at higher levels introduces a different kind of exposure, not just to outcomes, but to one's own internal decision-making process. It reveals how much of one's confidence is contingent on external validation, how comfortable one is with incomplete information, and how resilient one is when feedback is delayed or ambiguous. And for individuals who have built their professional identity around being precise, reliable, and correct, this exposure can feel destabilizing because it challenges the very foundation of how they have learned to define competence. You can observe this in the way decisions are approached when responsibility begins to expand. There is often a noticeable increase in analysis, not necessarily because the situation requires it, but because it provides a temporary sense of control. More data, more opinions, more perspectives. These become tools not just for better decision making, but for reducing the psychological discomfort of committing without certainty. And while this can enhance the quality of decisions in some cases, it can also function as a form of delay take where the underlying goal is not clarity, but reassurance. This creates a pattern where individuals remain highly engaged in preparation but hesitate at the point of commitment. They refine, optimize, and evaluate extensively. Yet when the moment arrives to make a decision that cannot be fully validated in advance, there is a subtle resistance, not overt enough to be recognized as avoidance, but consistent enough to limit the scope of responsibility they are willing to take on. And over time, this pattern reinforces itself because the absence of negative outcomes within a controlled scope feels like confirmation that the approach is working. However, what remains unexamined is the cost of this approach, not in terms of immediate performance, but in terms of long-term expansion. Because responsibility, particularly at higher levels, is less about achieving perfect outcomes and more about increasing the range of decisions one is willing to own. It is about developing a relationship with uncertainty that is not dependent on constant validation. And without this shift, progress tends to plateau in subtle ways. Roles become more complex, but not necessarily more autonomous. Influence increases, but within boundaries that still provide a sense of safety. There is also an identity component to this dynamic that often goes unnoticed. Many professionals derive a sense of self from being dependable, from being the person who gets things right, who minimizes risk, who operates with precision. And while these traits are valuable, they can also create a constraint when responsibility begins to require a different set of behaviors, ones that involve making imperfect decisions, navigating ambiguity, and accepting outcomes that cannot be fully controlled. Because embracing these behaviors can feel, at least initially, like a departure from the identity that has been carefully built over time. This is where responsibility begins to feel less like an opportunity and more like a trade-off. A trade-off between maintaining a familiar sense of competence and stepping into a space where that competence must be redefined. And for many, this trade-off is not consciously acknowledged. It is experienced instead as a preference for certain types of roles, certain types of challenges, certain types of environments. But underneath those preferences is often a consistent theme, a desire to remain within a range of responsibility that allows for confidence to be externally supported. Understanding this dynamic requires recognizing that the hesitation is not about capability, but about the conditions under which that capability is expressed. Most professionals are fully capable of handling greater responsibility in terms of skill and knowledge. The constraint lies in the psychological shift required to operate without the same level of external reinforcement. And until that shift is addressed, responsibility will continue to feel like something that needs to be carefully managed rather than fully embraced. So, the limitation is not in the absence of opportunity, nor in the lack of readiness, but in the relationship one has with their own judgment. And as long as that relationship remains dependent on validation, responsibility will continue to feel heavier than it actually is, not because of what it demands externally, but because of what it reveals internally. Next, we move deeper into how responsibility quietly reshapes the emotional landscape of work, particularly in how stress, pressure, and mental load are experienced, and why this transformation often leads individuals to unconsciously resist further expansion, even when they appear outwardly ambitious. Because responsibility is not just a structural shift in what one does, it is a psychological shift in what one carries. And the difference between the two is where much of the tension begins to accumulate. At earlier stages of a career, stress is often episodic. It is tied to deadlines, specific deliverables, or temporary peaks in workload. There is a rhythm to it, periods of intensity followed by periods of relative relief. Even when the work is demanding, there is an underlying sense that the pressure is contained within certain boundaries. Once a project is completed or a deadline is met, the stress dissipates, at least partially. This creates a form of recoverability where the mind can return to a baseline state between cycles of effort. As responsibility increases, however, this rhythm begins to change in a way that is not always immediately visible. Stress becomes less tied to specific tasks and more connected to ongoing ownership. It is no longer something that comes and goes with deadlines. It becomes more continuous, more ambient. The mind remains engaged not just with what is being done, but with what could happen, what might go wrong, what needs to be anticipated. And this shift from episodic stress to sustained mental load is one of the most significant yet under-examined aspects of higher responsibility. This is where many professionals begin to experience a subtle form of resistance that is difficult to articulate. On the surface, they may still pursue advancement, accept promotions, or take on more complex roles. But internally, there is an increasing sensitivity to the psychological cost associated with carrying more responsibility, not necessarily in terms of effort, but in terms of cognitive and emotional occupation. The work does not just demand time, it occupies attention, even in moments that are not formally part of the workday. You can observe this in the way individuals describe higher responsibility roles. There's often a shift in language from what they do to what they hold. They speak about things being on their mind, about having to think ahead, about carrying the weight of decisions. These are not just expressions. They reflect a genuine change in how responsibility is experienced internally. And for individuals who have built their lives around maintaining a certain level of mental clarity or personal space, this shift can feel intrusive. As a result, the avoidance of responsibility does not always manifest as a rejection of opportunity, but as a calibration of how much ongoing mental load one is willing to accept. Professionals may continue to progress, but they do so in ways that keep this load within a manageable range. They may prefer roles where responsibility is significant but still bounded, where the scope is clear, and where the cognitive demands do not extend indefinitely beyond working hours. And again, these choices are rarely framed as avoidance. They are experienced as preferences for balance, sustainability, or lifestyle alignment. What remains less examined is how these preferences are shaped by an underlying relationship with pressure. Because higher responsibility does not just increase workload, it changes the nature of pressure itself. It becomes less about meeting expectations and more about defining them. Less about responding to problems and more about anticipating them. And importantly, less about completing tasks and more about carrying outcomes that are still unfolding. This creates a form of psychological continuity that can feel difficult to disengage from. The mind remains partially occupied, even when there is no immediate action required. And for many, this continuous engagement becomes the point of friction, not because they cannot handle it, but because it alters the experience of their own mental space in a way that feels less controlled. There is also a deeper implication here related to identity. As responsibility increases, the boundary between professional and personal identity often becomes less distinct. Decisions carry more weight, outcomes feel more personal, and the sense of ownership extends beyond specific tasks into broader areas of life. And for individuals who value a clear separation between who they are and what they do, this blurring can create discomfort that is not easily resolved. So what appears on the surface as a desire for balance or a preference for certain types of roles can often be understood as a more nuanced response to how responsibility reshapes the internal experience of work. It is not simply about avoiding effort or challenge. It is about managing the ongoing psychological presence of responsibility in one's life. And until this aspect is recognized, the conversation around success remains incomplete. Because success is not just about what one achieves, but about what one is willing to continuously carry. And for many professionals, the hesitation is not about reaching higher levels, but about accepting the persistent mental and emotional load that those levels require. Now we will explore how responsibility subtly removes one of the most relied upon psychological protections in modern professional life, the ability to externalize outcomes, and why this loss, more than effort or complexity, becomes a defining point of resistance for many individuals. Because in structured environments, one of the most stabilizing features is not just clarity of role, but the diffusion of accountability. Outcomes, whether positive or negative, are rarely owned in isolation. They are shared across teams, systems, leadership decisions, market conditions, and timing. This diffusion creates a buffer that allows individuals to remain engaged without fully internalizing every result. At higher levels of responsibility, this buffer begins to dissolve. Not completely, but significantly enough that outcomes feel more directly tied to one's own decisions. And this shift is not merely functional, it is deeply psychological. Because when outcomes can no longer be easily externalized, they must be integrated. Success becomes more personal, but so does failure. And for many professionals, this integration is where discomfort intensifies, not because they are unprepared for success, but because they are less accustomed to absorbing failure without deflection. This is where a subtle but powerful behavioral pattern begins to emerge. Individuals continue to operate effectively within environments where outcomes can be contextualized externally, but they hesitate when moving into roles where that context becomes less available. They may accept responsibility in form, but not fully in psychological ownership. There remains a tendency to interpret results through external variables, even when their influence has diminished. And while this can preserve a sense of stability, it also limits the depth of engagement with responsibility itself. What makes this dynamic particularly complex is that externalization is not inherently negative. It serves an important function in maintaining psychological balance, especially in environments where outcomes are influenced by factors beyond individual control. But when over-relied upon, it creates a dependency, a need for outcomes to be explainable in ways that reduce personal exposure. And as responsibility increases, this need becomes harder to satisfy because the range of influence expands, and with it, the expectation of ownership. You can observe this in how individuals respond to ambiguous outcomes. In lower responsibility roles, ambiguity can often be resolved through reference points: what was expected, what others contributed, what constraints were present. But in higher responsibility contexts, these reference points become less definitive. The individual is often the one who defines expectations, who navigates constraints, who interprets contributions. And as a result, ambiguity cannot be fully externalized. It must be held internally, processed without immediate resolution. This introduces a form of psychological exposure that is qualitatively different from the pressures experienced earlier in one's career. It is not about being evaluated by others, but about evaluating oneself in the absence of clear external standards. And for individuals who have developed their sense of competence through external benchmarks, this shift can feel disorienting. Because the criteria for success are no longer fully defined, and the interpretation of outcomes becomes part of the responsibility itself. As a response, many professionals develop ways to maintain a degree of externalization even as their roles evolve. They may emphasize market conditions, organizational dynamics, or team factors when interpreting results. They may frame decisions within broader contexts that dilute individual ownership. And while these interpretations are often valid, they can also function as mechanisms that preserve a familiar relationship with responsibility, one where outcomes are not fully internalized. Over time, this creates a limitation that is not immediately visible. Individuals continue to perform, to progress, to achieve, but their engagement with responsibility remains partial. They operate at a level where ownership is sufficient for performance, but not complete enough for deeper expansion. And this partial ownership becomes a kind of ceiling, not imposed externally, but maintained internally through the way outcomes are processed. There is also an identity dimension to this process. Fully owning outcomes requires a willingness to integrate both success and failure into one's sense of self without distortion. It requires acknowledging influence without over-identifying with results. And this balance is not easily achieved, particularly for those who have been conditioned to associate success with validation and failure with inadequacy. Because full ownership challenges both of these associations. It reframes success as a result of judgment rather than approval. and failure as part of a process rather than a reflection of identity. This is where responsibility begins to demand a different kind of psychological maturity, one that is less dependent on external narratives and more grounded in internal interpretation. And for many, this shift is not immediately comfortable. It requires letting go of familiar ways of understanding outcomes and developing a more nuanced relationship with both control and uncertainty. So the resistance to responsibility is not simply about avoiding pressure or risk, it is about navigating a fundamental change in how outcomes are experienced and understood. It is about moving from a distributed model of accountability to a more concentrated one, where external explanations become less sufficient and internal ownership becomes more central. And until this transition is fully recognized, responsibility will continue to feel heavier than it objectively is, because it is carrying not just the weight of outcomes, but the weight of how those outcomes are interpreted. Next, we begin to understand how responsibility quietly disrupts one of the most deeply held assumptions in professional life, the belief that effort and outcomes are directly proportional, and why this disruption creates a form of psychological instability that many individuals instinctively avoid. Because throughout early career development, there is a relatively consistent reinforcement loop. Effort leads to results, preparation leads to correctness, and diligence leads to recognition. This relationship is not perfect, but it is stable enough to form a reliable mental model. And over time, this model becomes the foundation upon which individuals build their sense of control. As responsibility increases, however, this relationship begins to weaken in subtle but significant ways. Outcomes become influenced by a broader range of variables: timing, market conditions, team dynamics, second-order effects of decisions, many of which cannot be fully anticipated or controlled. And while effort remains necessary, it is no longer sufficient in the way it once was. The directness of the effort-to-outcome connection starts to dissolve, replaced by a more complex and less predictable system of causality. This shift introduces a form of psychological friction that is often misinterpreted. It is not simply frustration with unpredictability, it is a deeper discomfort with the loss of a familiar sense of fairness. Because the earlier model implies a kind of implicit contract. If you do the right things consistently, the right outcomes will follow. And while this contract holds reasonably well in structured environments, it becomes less reliable in contexts where responsibility involves shaping outcomes rather than executing toward them. For many professionals, this realization is not fully conscious, but it is deeply felt. There is a subtle recognition that increased responsibility does not guarantee proportional reward, nor does it protect against disproportionate negative outcomes. And this recognition creates hesitation, not because individuals are unwilling to work hard, but because the predictability of that work translating into results becomes less certain. You can observe this in how individuals respond to opportunities that involve higher levels of ownership. There is often a careful evaluation of not just the potential upside, but the variability of outcomes. Roles that introduce greater unpredictability, where success depends on multiple moving parts, where timelines are unclear, where results may take time to materialize, tend to generate more hesitation, even when they align with long-term growth. And this hesitation is not always framed as fear. It often appears as a preference for environments where effort and outcome remain more closely aligned. This creates a subtle but important pattern. Professionals gravitate toward areas where their input feels reliably connected to output. They optimize within systems that reward consistency and precision. They build expertise in domains where cause and effect are relatively clear. And while this leads to strong performance, it can also limit exposure to situations where responsibility requires navigating complexity rather than controlling it. There is also an emotional dimension to this dynamic that is often overlooked. When effort and outcome are closely linked, there is a sense of coherence in how one experiences work. Actions feel meaningful because their impact is visible and understandable. But when this link becomes less direct, the experience of work can feel more ambiguous. Effort may not immediately translate into results, and outcomes may not fully reflect the quality of input. And for individuals who derive a sense of stability from this coherence, the ambiguity can feel unsettling. As a result, the avoidance of responsibility is not just about avoiding risk, but about preserving a certain relationship with causality. It is about maintaining a world in which actions lead to predictable consequences, where effort feels reliably rewarded, and where outcomes can be understood through a clear chain of reasoning. And when responsibility begins to challenge this model, it introduces a level of uncertainty that is not easily reconciled. Over time, this leads to a form of selective engagement with growth. Individuals continue to develop, to take on more complex work, but they do so within domains where the relationship between effort and outcome remains relatively intact. They avoid, often unconsciously, areas where this relationship becomes more diffuse, where success depends less on direct input and more on navigating systems that are inherently unpredictable. This is where responsibility becomes a threshold not just of capability, but of how one interprets the nature of work itself. Because at higher levels, success is less about controlling variables and more about influencing them. It is less about executing known processes and more about operating within systems that cannot be fully mapped in advance. And this requires a different kind of psychological orientation, one that is comfortable with partial control and incomplete feedback. For many, this orientation does not come naturally, not because it is beyond their ability, but because it challenges the foundational assumptions that have guided their progress so far. And until those assumptions are examined and adjusted, responsibility will continue to feel misaligned with the internal model of how effort should translate into results. So the hesitation is not simply about stepping into more demanding roles. It is about stepping into a version of work where the rules are less defined, where outcomes are less predictable, and where the connection between what one does and what one receives is no longer straightforward. And for a mind that has been shaped around clarity and proportionality, this shift can feel less like advancement and more like a departure from a system that once made sense. Now we will explore how responsibility introduces a less visible but deeply consequential shift in how time itself is experienced, and why this altered perception becomes another quiet reason many professionals hesitate to move further into higher levels of success. Because at earlier stages of a career, time is largely structured, segmented, and externally defined. Work exists within clear boundaries: hours, deadlines, projects. And even when those boundaries extend, they retain a sense of containment. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Effort is applied within a time frame, and once that time frame concludes, there is a psychological permission to disengage. As responsibility expands, this structure begins to dissolve in a way that is not immediately obvious, but is consistently felt. Time becomes less segmented and more continuous. Decisions are no longer confined to specific windows. They extend beyond them. Problems do not always resolve within defined periods. They persist, evolve, and require ongoing attention. And importantly, the individual becomes the point through which this continuity is managed. Responsibility in this sense does not just occupy time, it reshapes it. This creates a subtle but meaningful shift in how professionals experience their days. Work is no longer something that is simply done within allocated hours. It becomes something that remains cognitively present even when no active task is being performed. The mind revisits decisions, anticipates outcomes, and processes variables that are still in motion. And while this does not always translate into visible effort, it creates a form of mental occupation that is difficult to fully disengage from. For many individuals, this shift is not consciously recognized, but it is intuitively felt. There is a growing awareness that higher responsibility does not just require more time, but a different relationship with time, one where boundaries are less defined and disengagement is less complete. And this awareness influences decisions in subtle ways. Opportunities that involve greater ownership are evaluated not just in terms of workload, but in terms of how they will alter the experience of one's time. You can observe this in the preference for roles that maintain a degree of temporal clarity. Positions where expectations are clear, where work can be completed within predictable cycles, and where there is a recognizable end to periods of effort tend to feel more sustainable. Even when these roles are demanding, they offer a form of psychological closure. And this closure becomes increasingly valuable as professionals seek to preserve a sense of control over their mental space. In contrast, roles that involve higher levels of responsibility often lack this closure. Decisions made today may have implications that unfold over weeks or months. Outcomes may remain uncertain for extended periods, and the individual remains mentally connected to these processes, even in the absence of immediate action. This creates a form of temporal extension, where the boundaries between work and non-work become less distinct, not necessarily in terms of hours, but in terms of cognitive presence. There is also a deeper implication here related to how individuals perceive the ownership of their own time. At lower levels of responsibility, time often feels allocated, assigned by schedules, meetings, and tasks. As responsibility increases, time becomes something that must be actively managed, prioritized, and in some cases, defended. And this shift introduces a new layer of decision-making that is not just about what to do, but about what to carry forward in attention. This can create a sense of continuous engagement that is not always comfortable, because the mind is not only processing current tasks, but also holding unresolved elements that do not have clear endpoints. And for individuals who value a sense of completion, this ongoing openness can feel like a loss of resolution. It is not that the work is overwhelming, but that it remains partially unfinished in a way that cannot be easily closed. As a result, the hesitation around responsibility often includes an unspoken consideration. How will this change my experience of time? Not in terms of hours worked, but in terms of how much of my mental space will remain occupied. And this question, while rarely articulated directly, plays a significant role in how opportunities are evaluated. Over time, this leads to a form of optimization, where professionals seek roles that balance advancement with temporal containment. They progress, but within structures that allow for periodic disengagement. They take on responsibility, but in ways that preserve a sense of closure. And while this approach can lead to stability and sustained performance, it can also limit the extent to which responsibility is fully embraced. Because at higher levels, responsibility and time become intertwined in a way that cannot be easily separated. The more one owns, the more one remains connected to outcomes that are still unfolding. And this connection extends beyond formal working hours into the background of daily life. It is not always intrusive, but it is persistent. So the resistance is not simply about avoiding more work or more pressure. It is about preserving a certain experience of time, one that allows for clear boundaries, for disengagement, for moments where the mind is not holding unresolved responsibility. And until this shift is fully understood, responsibility will continue to feel like something that expands not just one's role, but the very structure of how one's life is experienced. Next, we move deeper into how responsibility quietly alters one's relationship with identity, particularly the way success and self-worth begin to merge, and why this merging creates a level of psychological risk that many professionals instinctively try to regulate. Because at earlier stages of a career, identity is often distributed across multiple dimensions. Work is important, but it is not yet the primary lens through which one evaluates themselves. There is still a degree of separation between what one does and who one is, and this separation provides a form of stability. Outcomes matter, but they do not fully define the individual. As responsibility increases, however, this separation begins to narrow. The decisions one makes carry more weight, the outcomes become more visible, and the sense of ownership deepens. And with this, work starts to occupy a more central position in how identity is experienced. Success feels more personal, not just because of external recognition, but because it reflects one's judgment, direction, and influence. At the same time, setbacks begin to feel less like isolated events and more like reflections of one's capability or decision-making. This creates a subtle but powerful shift. Responsibility does not just increase what one does, it increases how much of oneself is invested in what is done. And for many professionals, this increased investment introduces a new kind of vulnerability. Because the more closely identity is tied to outcomes, the more exposure one has to fluctuations in those outcomes. Stability becomes harder to maintain, not externally, but internally. You can observe this in how individuals respond to both success and failure as their level of responsibility grows. Success may bring a temporary sense of validation, but it also raises expectations, both internally and externally. There is a quiet pressure to sustain performance, to continue making the right decisions, to justify the level of responsibility that has been attained. And this pressure, while often unspoken, becomes part of the ongoing experience of work. At the same time, failure begins to carry a different weight. It is no longer just about what went wrong, but about what that outcome suggests about one's judgment or capability. Even when the failure is objectively influenced by multiple factors, the internal interpretation tends to be more concentrated. And this concentration increases the emotional impact, making the experience of responsibility more intense than it appears from the outside. As a result, many professionals begin to regulate how much of their identity they allow to be tied to their work. This regulation does not always happen consciously. It emerges through choices that maintain a certain distance between self and outcome, roles that offer recognition but not full ownership, environments where accountability is shared, positions where success is visible but not entirely self-defined. These become more appealing, not because they lack challenge, but because they provide a form of psychological insulation. There is also a deeper layer to this dynamic related to how individuals define themselves in the absence of clear outcomes. At higher levels of responsibility, feedback becomes less immediate and less definitive. There are longer cycles between action and result, and outcomes are often more ambiguous. And in this space, identity must be sustained without constant reinforcement. One must continue to operate, to decide, to move forward, even when there is no clear signal that one is doing so correctly. For individuals who have developed their sense of self through consistent feedback and measurable success, this can feel destabilizing because the usual markers that support identity are less available, and the responsibility to define one's own standards becomes more central. And this is not just a functional shift, it is a psychological one. It requires a different way of relating to oneself, one that is less dependent on external validation and more grounded in internal coherence. Over time, this creates a threshold that is not easily crossed. It is not about capability, effort, or even ambition. It is about how much of one's identity one is willing to place into an environment where outcomes are uncertain, feedback is delayed, and ownership is concentrated. And for many, this threshold becomes the point at which progress slows. Not because opportunities are unavailable, but because the psychological cost of further integration feels too high. So the hesitation around responsibility is not simply about avoiding risk or pressure. It is about managing the relationship between success and self. It is about maintaining a version of identity that feels stable, even as the external demands of responsibility begin to challenge that stability. And until this relationship is examined more closely, responsibility will continue to feel like something that expands not just what one does, but who one becomes in ways that are not always comfortable to navigate. Now the perspective shifts toward one of the more overlooked tensions within responsibility, the way it gradually removes the clarity of comparison, and with it, the sense of relative positioning that many professionals unconsciously rely on to evaluate their progress. Because in structured environments, comparison is not just inevitable, it is stabilizing. There are peers, benchmarks, performance ratings, compensation bands, clear reference points that allow individuals to understand where they stand. And this relative positioning provides a form of psychological orientation. It answers, often implicitly, the question, am I doing well? As responsibility increases, however, these reference points begin to fade. Roles become less standardized, paths become less linear, and outcomes become more individualized. There are fewer direct comparisons, fewer clearly defined peers operating under identical conditions. And while this may appear liberating on the surface, it introduces a different kind of uncertainty, one that is not about performance itself, but about how performance is interpreted. Without clear comparison, the evaluation of success becomes more internal and more ambiguous. It is no longer sufficient to measure progress against others, because the contexts are no longer directly comparable. One person's outcome may be influenced by variables that are not visible, not replicable, or not even fully understood, and as a result, the traditional markers of progress lose some of their clarity. This creates a subtle but persistent discomfort. Because comparison, while often criticized, serves an important psychological function. It reduces ambiguity. It provides a framework through which effort and outcome can be contextualized. And when that framework becomes less available, individuals are left with a more open-ended question. What does success look like here? For many professionals, this question is not easy to answer, not because they lack ambition, but because their previous understanding of success has been shaped within systems that offered clear signals, promotions, titles, compensation increases. These served as indicators that progress was being made. But as responsibility expands, these signals become less frequent, less standardized, and less definitive. You can observe this in the way individuals respond to roles that lack clear benchmarks. There is often a preference for environments where performance can still be measured against defined criteria, where there are visible indicators of advancement, where one can still answer with some degree of certainty whether they are moving forward. In contrast, roles that involve creating new paths, defining new standards, or operating in less structured contexts tend to generate more hesitation, even when they offer greater potential for growth. This hesitation is not simply about risk. It is about the loss of a familiar orientation system. Because when comparison fades, so does a certain type of reassurance. One can no longer rely on external signals to confirm that they are on the right track, and this requires a different kind of stability, one that is not dependent on relative positioning but on an internal sense of direction. There is also an identity component to this shift. Many professionals have, over time, built a sense of self that is partially anchored in how they compare to others. Not in an overtly competitive way, but in a subtle, continuous calibration. Am I progressing at the expected pace? Am I performing at a high level relative to my peers? These questions, while often implicit, contribute to a sense of coherence in how one experiences their career. As responsibility increases and comparison becomes less clear, this coherence begins to loosen. The individual is no longer operating within a clearly defined cohort. Their path becomes more individualized, and with that comes a reduction in shared reference points. And this can feel isolating, not socially, but psychologically, because the usual mechanisms for understanding one's position are no longer as reliable. As a result, many professionals unconsciously limit how far they move into roles where this ambiguity becomes dominant. They seek environments where comparison is still possible, where benchmarks still exist, where progress can still be measured in familiar ways. And while this provides a sense of clarity, it also maintains a boundary around the level of responsibility they are willing to engage with. Because at higher levels, responsibility often requires operating without clear comparison. It involves defining success rather than measuring against it. It requires a form of self-orientation that is not externally reinforced. And this shift, while subtle, represents a significant psychological transition. So the resistance is not just about taking on more responsibility in a functional sense. It is about stepping into a space where the usual markers of progress are less visible, where comparison provides less guidance, and where responsibility to define one's own standards becomes central. And for many, this shift introduces a level of ambiguity that feels less like freedom and more like a loss of structure, making responsibility something that is approached carefully rather than fully embraced. Next, we move deeper into a quieter but more confronting realization that responsibility does not just expand opportunity, it removes excuses, and in doing so, it exposes a level of personal agency that many professionals are not fully comfortable holding. Because within structured systems, there is always some degree of limitation that can be referenced. Constraints of hierarchy, policy, timing, or external decision-making provide a framework within which outcomes can be understood. And within that framework, there is a subtle but important psychological relief. Not everything is fully within one's control. As responsibility increases, this relief begins to diminish. The range of influence expands, decisions carry more weight, and the ability to attribute outcomes solely to external constraints becomes less available. This does not mean that external factors disappear, but their explanatory power weakens. The individual becomes more central to the outcome, not just as a participant, but as a driver. And with this shift, comes a different kind of pressure, one that is not imposed externally but experienced internally as a heightened awareness of one's own agency. This is where responsibility begins to feel confronting in a way that is difficult to articulate. Because having more control over outcomes also means having fewer places to defer accountability. It reduces the space between action and consequence, and in doing so, it brings into focus the extent to which results are shaped by one's own decisions. And while this level of agency is often associated with empowerment, it also introduces a form of psychological exposure that many individuals instinctively regulate. You can observe this in how professionals approach roles where decision-making authority is significantly increased. There is often an initial attraction to the autonomy, to the ability to influence direction, to the removal of constraints that once limited progress. But alongside this attraction, there is a quieter hesitation, an awareness that with greater control comes a corresponding reduction in external explanations. Outcomes become harder to contextualize in ways that diffuse responsibility and more difficult to separate from one's own judgment. This creates a subtle tension between the desire for autonomy and the weight of what that autonomy entails. Because autonomy is not simply the freedom to act, it is the responsibility to own the consequences of those actions without relying on external structures to absorb or explain them. And for many professionals, this is where the appeal of responsibility begins to shift. It is no longer just an opportunity for growth, but a commitment to a different relationship with accountability. There is also a deeper psychological layer to this dynamic, related to how individuals perceive control itself. At earlier stages, control is often experienced indirectly, through competence, through reliability, through the ability to execute within defined systems. But as responsibility increases, control becomes more direct and more visible. Decisions have broader implications, and the link between one's choices and the resulting outcomes becomes more apparent. And this visibility can be unsettling, because it challenges the idea that outcomes are primarily shaped by external conditions. It introduces the possibility that one's own thinking, judgment, and prioritization play a more significant role than previously acknowledged. And while this can be empowering, it also requires a willingness to confront the limits of one's current approach without the buffer of external attribution. As a result, many professionals unconsciously calibrate how much agency they are willing to hold. They move into positions that offer increased influence, but still retain enough structure to share accountability. They accept decision-making authority, but within environments where outcomes can still be contextualized through broader factors. And again, these choices are rarely framed as avoidance. They're experienced as alignment with organizational dynamics, as practical considerations, as thoughtful career moves. What remains less visible is the underlying pattern, a consistent effort to maintain a balance between control and insulation. Enough responsibility to feel engaged and progressing, but not so much that all outcomes become fully attributable to one's own decisions. And while this balance can be sustainable, it also creates a boundary around the depth of responsibility that is fully embraced. Because at higher levels, this balance becomes harder to maintain. Responsibility and agency become more tightly linked, and the ability to separate them diminishes. The individual becomes both the source of direction and the point of accountability. And this integration requires a different kind of psychological acceptance, one that is less about managing perception and more about fully engaging with the reality of influence. So the hesitation is not simply about avoiding pressure or complexity. It is about navigating a shift in how much of one's life is experienced as self-directed and how much is attributed to external structure. It is about moving from a position where responsibility is shared and contextualized to one where it is more concentrated and personal. And for many, this shift introduces a level of clarity that feels less comfortable than the ambiguity it replaces, making responsibility something that is approached with caution rather than fully claimed. Now we will explore what it actually means to move beyond this resistance, not as a strategy or a method, but as a shift in how responsibility itself is understood, and why success begins to feel different once this shift occurs. Because up to this point, responsibility has been experienced as something that adds weight, complexity, exposure, and uncertainty. And in many ways, that interpretation is accurate. But it is also incomplete, because it frames responsibility as an external burden rather than an internal alignment. What begins to change, often gradually and without a clear moment of transition, is the realization that responsibility is not something being added to one's life, but something that was always present in a diffused form. At lower levels, it was distributed across systems, roles, and expectations. At higher levels, it becomes more concentrated. But the nature of responsibility itself does not fundamentally change. Only the clarity of one's relationship with it does. This shift reduces a certain type of internal conflict, because the tension was never simply about handling more work or making more decisions. It was about the gap between wanting the outcomes of success and resisting the structure that produces those outcomes. And when that gap begins to close, responsibility starts to feel less like an imposition and more like a coherent extension of how one operates. There is also a subtle change in how uncertainty is experienced. Earlier, uncertainty was something to be minimized, managed, or avoided. It was interpreted as a signal that more information was needed, that more preparation was required, that more validation should be sought. But as responsibility becomes more fully integrated, uncertainty begins to lose some of its threatening quality. Not because it disappears, but because it is no longer interpreted as a disruption. It becomes part of the environment rather than a deviation from it. This does not eliminate pressure or complexity. Those remain, but they are experienced differently. There is less need to constantly resolve ambiguity before acting, less dependence on external validation to confirm direction for back, and less effort spent maintaining a sense of control that was never fully attainable. And in place of that effort, there is a quieter form of engagement, one that is more focused on movement than on certainty. You can observe this shift in how decisions are approached. There is still analysis, still consideration, still attention to detail, but there is less hesitation at the point where information becomes incomplete. The decision is made not because it is guaranteed to be correct, but because it is coherent within the context available, and once made, it is owned without excessive reinterpretation or deflection. There is also a change in how outcomes are integrated. Success is no longer overinterpreted as validation, and failure is no longer overinterpreted as inadequacy. Both are understood as part of a broader process where influence exists, but control is never absolute. And this understanding reduces the emotional volatility that often accompanies responsibility. It creates a more stable internal environment, even when external conditions remain complex. Importantly, this shift does not make responsibility lighter in an objective sense. The scope remains, the stakes remain, the demands remain, but it removes the additional layer of resistance that was amplifying the experience. The mental energy that was previously spent negotiating with responsibility, limiting it, reframing it, avoiding its full weight, becomes available for engaging with it more directly. And this is where success begins to feel different, not necessarily larger or more visible, but more internally consistent. There is less fragmentation between what one wants and what one is willing to hold. The pursuit of success no longer feels like a movement towards something external, but like an alignment with a level of responsibility that was previously approached with hesitation. For many professionals, this does not happen through a deliberate decision, but through gradual exposure. As they take on more, as they experience both positive and negative outcomes, as they recognize that the anticipated weight of responsibility is often more psychological than actual, their relationship with it begins to recalibrate. And over time, what once felt like a threshold begins to feel like a natural extension. So the question is not whether responsibility will always feel comfortable. It likely will not, but whether it continues to feel misaligned. Because discomfort in this context is not necessarily a signal of something being wrong. It is often a reflection of something expanding beyond familiar structures. And when that distinction becomes clear, the resistance begins to lose its hold. Responsibility is no longer something to be carefully approached or partially accepted. It becomes something that is engaged with more fully, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that it is inseparable from the version of success that one is moving toward. If this conversation has felt familiar in ways that are difficult to articulate, that is often where the most important observations begin, not as conclusions, but as points of awareness that continue to unfold over time. And if this kind of thinking resonates with you, you may find value in returning to it, sharing it, or simply allowing it to sit in the background as you move through your own decisions.